Okay, so for my project, I interviewed two people. So the first is my uncle David, who emigrated from Kenya to the US, and the second person is my dad's best friend, and now family friend, Mike. Mike immigrated to Germany, Japan, and Hong Kong. Both of these guys were voluntary migrants. David's life in Kenya was not easy. He was working multiple jobs, and it still wasn't enough to support his mom and siblings, which was expected of him. His migration was also an example of rural to urban migration. So their motivations to migrate were very different. David's major pull factor was education. Another big pull factor was quality of life, as he did not see a future for himself in Kenya. Similarly, a push factor was economics. He talks a bit about if you were born a have, you would die a have, and if you were born a have-not, you would die a have-not. Mike's major pull factor was his curiosity and interest to experience new cultures. So Mike studied German throughout high school and college, so he chose to study abroad in Germany. Germany is also known to be an expat-friendly place. From there, Mike then moved to Tokyo, where he lived for over 10 years. This is where he met his wife, Mommy, and where his daughter, Mesa, was born. She's about 10 now. They moved to Hong Kong when Mommy got a big promotion, and when Mike decided to go full into photography. He formerly worked in a bank. Hong Kong is also a good move for them because English was spoken there. So David's migration process, he said, took around a total of 6 months. So he had a sponsor, which was his former boss, who helped him and applied for a passport for him. Once that got approved, he had to get interviewed for a visa, which luckily he was granted. Mike's move to Germany was also pretty easy just because he was a student and the paperwork was mostly done by the universities. Japan was a bit more difficult. He was granted a temporary visa, but he couldn't work on that visa, so he had to travel to Seoul, basically just the closest Japanese embassy, to get a work visa processed. His family's move to Hong Kong was simpler than the move to Japan just because Mommy's company handled it all, and they were able to do it in their native tongue. Both of these guys moved for work. So Mike has migrated multiple times, so I was curious to see if it gets easier or harder or whatever. He said that he does feel like it gets easier, but it also was easier when he was younger. And I mean, he's 50 now. He kind of says he just wants to settle down somewhere. Although his move to Hong Kong was very different because he was with his entire family instead of moving alone for the first two. So, luckily, neither Mike nor David encountered big issues after migrating of their treatment. David actually said people were incredibly kind and even invited him to their holiday meals. Mike said there was some anti-American propaganda while he was in Germany as the Gulf War was going on. I know my mom was in Greece at the time and she had to go home because it was too dangerous for her to be there, the anti-American stuff. He said Japan was hard to integrate with the locals, which makes sense. So after living in both Kenya and the US, David said that they are very different. So one big difference is language. He also said that education is not free, which causes less people to have an education. It also makes it nearly impossible for poorer families in Kenya to get an education and ultimately get out of poverty. Farming is also much bigger in Kenya than the US. It is over 1/4 of their GDP, and 3 out of 4 Kenyans work in agriculture. So David was very surprised by life in the US and said it did take him a long time to adjust, but he considers himself fully adjusted now. He had never even seen snow before, which is kind of crazy. He was really brave to leave everything he knew and his family. So both of their lives have changed tremendously since they migrated. David met my aunt. They were actually coworkers, and he has 3 kids in the US now. However, he doesn't get to see his parents or siblings, and he misses them dearly. Mike also still has ties in the US, but most of the people in his life are in Tokyo or Hong Kong now. So I asked both of the guys if there was kind of a favorite part of their life post-migration. David said being able to vote is a huge highlight for him living in the US. And Mike talked about the art and music scene in Hong Kong, as well as the people. Thank you everyone for listening. It was really interesting to interview these 2 transnational migrants, but with very different stories. Thanks.